You'll want to hear this all the way to the end. If you like tense, slow-burning turnarounds and a twist of impossible odds, stay with me, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this. Marble underfoot was cold enough to bite the soles of Renata Kensington's heels through thin designer leather. The Onyx Tower lobby hummed with the low, regulated breath of the building's life. Air moving through vents, an elevator insomniac in its glass fishbowl, the distant click of heels muting into the city. She moved like she owned the horizon, shoulders squared to the skyline, and yet that night she carried a weight behind her jaw she had not permitted herself to name in public. A hostile takeover framed as courtesy. A friendly voice on the board that now sounded like rope. A signature that would mean everything. He was low in the field of vision, the janitor bent beneath a ficus, the mop a faded flag across his shoulder. His jacket carried the detergent's tang, faintly sweet. A custodian's cap shadowed quick, preternatural eyes. Those eyes that missed nothing. For a heartbeat, Renata believed him background, part of the building's furniture. Then a glint near his palm caught the lamplight, and she recognized emotion she had not seen in a long time. Fingers that sorted detail the way a surgeon sorted instruments. He lifted something small and dark from the marble, no larger than a coin, and cupped it like a woman cradling a bird. She stopped. The sound of a man humming under his breath, a tune she could have sworn once belonged to a radio in a lab. He had the gait of someone who understood machines, not mops. She watched the way his thumb brushed a seam in the object, the way his lips formed a suppressed count. She should have kept going. She did not. "You dropped this." She did not announce herself with her name. She didn't need to. The city knew her silhouette. The janitor looked up, and the building rearranged itself in him, eyes centering on her like a white-knuckled compass finding north. "It wasn't mine," he said. His voice had the rasp of sleep-thin evenings and the economy of a man who had learned not to waste words. He handed her the dark oval. For a second their hands met. Her nails precise, his work rough beneath the skin. The object was a data key, an unremarkable slab of plastic and memory, but in its reflection the lobby multiplied into 1,000 possible outcomes. A guard in the rotating doors cleared his throat, the sound like a small animal. Renata's mouth tightened. "You know what this is?" she asked. The janitor's eyes narrowed. He pulled his cap forward. "Not from the building's kits, not ours," he said. It smelled like the loading dock. He said it as if he were cataloging, and her curiosity, rare as winter sunlight, turned to something sharp and precise. She should have walked away. The board had counsel, she had a legal team, she kept danger at arm's length. But for the first time in years, Renata found herself listening to a voice she could not have heard in the pulse of press conferences. The man did not posture. He did not plead. He looked at her and then at the data key and said, "If you plug it in wrong, it'll make trouble you can't see." He spoke like someone who had once been paid to see trouble before it arrived. That admission, half warning, half promise, was the hook. Renata smelled betrayal like she smelled coffee, too familiar to be one thing now, and the evidence of someone else's hand all over it. The boardroom had been seduced by numbers. She had been seduced by the illusion of control. Now control had an odd partner, a janitor who knew the difference between a patch and a trap. His name on the badge of his uniform read Nathaniel Rao.
She learned, in the space between dismissing him and deciding to follow him, how many small lives the tower held. Nate moved through service corridors with a reverence usually reserved for mothers and old houses. He navigated the building's underside like a man remembering his childhood streets. Tacit knowledge of where the wiring ran thinner, where the cameras were polite and where they were blunt. He worked with a quiet economy, mop, cart, checklist. Each action punctuated by the habit of keeping things that mattered within reach. A Polaroid of a little girl, taped to the inside of his locker, kept watch over his sandwiches. A tiny amber bottle rattled softly when he opened his toolbox, Lily's medication. He tucked the bottle into his palm like prayer. Renata watched him from the corner of her glass office, the city fanned out below her like an arrangement of promises. She could call doorstep security. She could have a lawyer start a chain of subpoenas that would turn a coin into a cacophony of counsel and court orders. Instead, she asked herself a question she had long stopped admitting to. Who in this tower could still see the machine, the oil inside it, and understand how to move the gears without making them grind? Nate did not consider himself salvageable the way she likely wanted him to. He carried the neat, fatalist lesson of the dismissed. The world had a way of exiling the competent. Once he had been an analyst, a maker of algorithms, and the man who had argued for the casing that kept data honest. He had published once, quietly, on pattern recognition. He had been good enough to be hired, and then good enough to be feared. His name had been a ledger entry, then a rumor, then a scar. He fell through the world and took the one job that would let him keep his hands steady enough to tuck a child into bed. He had a daughter with a medical ledger. She needed a treatment, a genetic enzyme deficiency, the doctor had said, something treatable, expensive, and precise. Lily's care was a rhythm in Nate's life. The little brown bottle lined in his locker, a photo with a gap-toothed smile, the way he counted the hours until the next infusion. Renata watched him from the corner of her glass office. The city fanned out below her like an arrangement of promises. She could call doorstep security. She could have a lawyer start a chain of subpoenas that would turn a coin into a cacophony of counsel and court orders. Instead, she asked herself a question she had long stopped admitting to. Who in this tower could still see the machine, the oil inside it, and understand how to move the gears without making them grind? Nate did not consider himself salvageable the way she likely wanted him to. He carried the neat, fatalist lesson of the dismissed. The world had a way of exiling the competent. Once he had been an analyst, a maker of algorithms, and the man who had argued for the casing that kept data honest. He had published once, quietly, on pattern recognition. He had been good enough to be hired, and then good enough to be feared. His name had been a ledger entry, then a rumor, then a scar. He fell through the world and took the one job that would let him keep his hands steady enough to tuck a child into bed. He had a daughter with a medical ledger. She needed a treatment, a genetic enzyme deficiency, the doctor had said, something treatable, expensive, and precise. Lily's care was a rhythm in Nate's life. The little brown bottle lined in his locker, a photo with a gap-toothed smile, the way he counted the hours until the next infusion.
Renata did not come to him with charity. She came with calculation. She saw, with the logistical lucidity of a woman who had learned consequence as a profession, that leverage came in unusual shapes. She slid a chair across from him, the leather sighing. The janitor wiped his hands on the rag, as if he'd been caught with a private thought. "Mr. Rowe," she said, not introducing herself by name, because for that moment she wanted rank to take the edge off familiarity. "I need someone who can read things people would prefer not to have read."
He laughed then, short and disbelieving, and it sounded like a man measuring how much to hope. "You want janitorial discretion with C-suite results," he said. It was not mockery, it was inventory. "Why me?" She told him only enough. The Cyberus acquisition was a public spectacle, a handshake that would promise 2 years of dominance across a market Renata had built from the careful erosion of competitors. Landon Valerius, the kind of financier who treated buyouts like religious conversions, had been tasting blood in the company's margins for months. Rumors hardened into movements when a clause appeared in the acquisition paperwork. A little line, a Trojan amendment, technical in phrasing but lethal in consequence. If activated, it could nullify Kensington's protective architecture and hand control to outside interests in the stretch of a single market day. "And Arthur?" Nate asked without being told. He had the cadence of someone who had read too many memos and seen too many exits. Renata named the betrayer without inflection. Arthur Clemens, mentor, elder on the board, man whose face had been Renata's GPS for corporate morality for 2 decades. "He signed the amendment?" she said. Renata's eyes narrowed, and the boardroom's chandelier shadows seemed to narrow with them. Nate's fingers went to the mop handle on instinct. "You don't trust your board," he said, more observation than accusation. She did not answer, which was acceptance in steel. "You'll help me find out whether that amendment has a skeleton," she said, "and if it does, we'll break its back in public." Nate hesitated, because the ledger in his chest weighed the cost. Helping a billionaire might mean airbrushed respite for Lily. It might mean exposure that would collapse the careful life he had built to avoid attention. It might also mean subjects he did not wish to revisit. His name in filings, questions about why a man once inside the machine had been allowed to fall out. He thought of Lily's laugh, the way a man thinks of returning home after a long shift, a harbor. He thought of the pill bottle, the sleep-thin nights, the dentist's jokes about a missing tooth. He saw a future where Lily's shoulders were free of the chronic worry of illness, and he could not refuse.
They worked in the executive suite's shade of green, the war room Renata assembled in rooms beneath the city where glass was replaced with screens and the air tasted like cold coffee and determination. Evelyn Reed arrived like an inevitable law, retired, precise, and able to write clauses that squeezed opponents into corners they had not noticed were traps. Marcus Cole appeared later and moved like a man for whom sleep was transactional, sharp, skeptical, and dangerously brilliant. He had been Renata's protege and then a wandering genius the company had lost to startups and reclusive code audits. When Renata told him she had a janitor who used to be an analyst, Marcus's eyebrow arched into an invitation, and he came. They began like surgeons preparing a complex operation. Nate reviewed security pathways the way a man thumbed the spine of a book he had loved and left. He read camera rotations, found blind frames, and cataloged the lobby's small gaps. He put his finger on the night a peripheral vendor had been given unsupervised access to the executive floor. He traced a pattern in delivery logs that felt like choreography, a man with Arthur's cadence meeting with a courier who was not in any registry and who, 3 times in 6 weeks, had slipped a sealed envelope into a courier bag with a dancer-like precision. The envelope looked like corporate courtesy, a non-disclosure tag, a gold-embossed note. It was bureaucratic theater the rest of the board had applauded. They found the footage in a backup server, security camera files stowed in a forgotten archive, compressed and then misnamed. Nate was the kind of person who could stare at timestamps until secrets unraveled. The footage had the flinch of low resolution and the intimacy of a confession.
There was Arthur, steady as a lighthouse, greeting the courier in the glass fishbowl of the elevator. He signed, pen glinting, a gold-plated pen Renata always recognized as hers at parties, and slid a small envelope into the courier's bag. Renata watched the shape of his shoulders in the footage and felt the betrayal as a physical thing, a pressure that moved across her chest like the tide. The image froze on Arthur's face, a man whose smile had always been a currency, now a blade. Nate watched it with a patient, almost protective fury. He noticed small things the cameras did not mean to record, the way Arthur's eyes flicked to the pen, the way his thumb hesitated. There was movement at angles that suggested someone had altered the script after the hand had been extended. He replayed the frames and found, buried in the metadata, just like the old days, evidence of a re-encoded stream. It did not tell him who had changed the frames. It told him someone had tried to hide the act by folding it into a larger archive. That was enough. They had proof, but not with the aesthetic righteousness of courtroom exhibits. They had a sliver of a thing that would convict in public if placed so carefully the board could not twist it into denial. Evelyn set the footage beside a draft amendment and pressed her hands together like a woman composing argument from evidence and law. "We don't go to the regulators with a hole," she said. "We go with a nail." "Then we make them see the hole." Renata cut the air like a seamstress slicing the wrong thread. "We don't simply accuse Arthur of betrayal. We expose the mechanism and show the public what it would do to the company if activated." The Trojan Amendment was a phrase they repeated in the war room like an incantation. It sounded technical, the kind of phrase that would make headlines for its complexity and bury danger in specialist unknowability. In truth, it was a legal lever that, if deployed at a certain corporate terminal moment, would transfer governance control in a blink. Landon Valerius had found it in the small print crevices and intended to pull it at market hour, a savage choreography. Sign here, push the protocol, and the Argent algorithm would do the rest. Argent, a name like silver, a ghost inside the market. The algorithm was a weapon of pattern and speed. It preyed on the thin membranes of liquidity and moved with a patience that disguised violence. Marcus described Argent as an animal, not cruel, precise, not spiteful, efficient. He liked metaphors because they framed things for investors and lawyers and men who could not see the code but could understand a story. Marcus would not write offensive code in the room. They would not perpetrate the sort of tactics that carried operational how-to. But they could design a counterpoint, a market-side mechanism that would make the activation of the Trojan Amendment catastrophic for those who would attempt it. They would place a kill switch not in the algorithm's code. Instead, they'd create a legal and market dance that turned the weapon's speed against it. Nate listened and then rewrote mental equations. He had not been paid by anyone to think like this for years. The janitor's world had been so small, mopping, checklists, Lily's smile, that the return of pattern recognition felt like a muscle remembered. He sat deep into the chair and felt the old cleverness purr awake. If they could produce irrefutable proof that the amendment had been inserted in bad faith, and then craft a public motion to nullify it, the board would be forced into a theater they had not rehearsed for, a live market day where the company's fate would hinge on a signature and the optics of virtue. They worked through the night. Marcus drafted a market posture that would make the algorithm's activation self-defeating. Evelyn wrote an amendment that would require public ratification under a clause Arthur had not anticipated.
Renata, used to moving the chess pieces herself, allowed Nate the space to do the forensic work. He rebuilt a trace file of the courier's movements, found a timestamp anomaly that placed the envelope in Arthur's hand at a time when Arthur had testified to being in a different meeting. It was the kind of small contradiction that, in public, became a tree trunk for the rest of the story to lean on. They had a video, too, grainy, intimate, but damning. In the footage, Arthur signed, and then his smile softened in the way people allow themselves when they do wrong, as if mercy could be an apology for calculation. Renata watched that frame until the pixels blurred. Her mouth became fine wire. She looked at Nate, who was no longer aware of the mop in his hands or the Polaroid in his locker. He was reading patterns the way a composer read music. "You'll need to be ready in 48 hours, Evelyn said. "Public filing on Friday, market close that same day. We make our move while they try to use speed as obfuscation." Nate thought of Lily's next infusion. 48 hours could make all the difference. The small things kept him human. In the war room, when strategy got technical and voices shortened into code-like nouns, he reached into his coat and touched the amber bottle he kept there. Renata watched him do it and did not ask why. She was no sentimentalist, but she knew the arithmetic of returns. A man who cleaned floors for a living and still remembered the price of a pill knew how to value time like an heirloom. "Why are you helping me?" she asked him one night when the city outside counted its own breathing in blue and white. She asked the question not to demand an explanation, but to understand the currency of his motives. She needed him to be reliable, not merely useful. Nate looked down at his hands. "Because if I don't, it's just a different kind of failure," he said. "I was inside machines that decided other people's hours. I saw what they did to names. I learned how they lie. If I keep quiet now, that's the same as letting them take what they want." Renata's jaw left a small shadow. She saw in him, clear as the glass of her elevators, the intersection of humility and stubbornness. She had built a company on the assumption that people acted in predictable interest. Nate reminded her that not all interests were financial. Some were visceral. Some were small and stubborn and about a girl with a gap-toothed grin. They staged the bait carefully. The public filing would be the hamster wheel that forced speed. The market would twitch like a trained animal. Marcus built a posture that would create a rapid feedback loop should Argent try to trigger. Evelyn wrote a counter-amendment that required public certification and a visible signature. Renata rehearsed the press posture. Nate rehearsed his fingers on a mouse the way a pianist warmed calluses. But proof is a fragile thing.
It sits in the open and waits to be smudged by denials and old loyalties. Arthur had experience. They lured him with a scheduled lunch. It was a theater of civility. Renata asked for his presence under the pretext of gratitude. The board liked the appearance of unity. The plaza outside the tower carried the city's wind, and on a warm Thursday they walked like people who had outlived the need to pretend. Renata kept her tone measured, steps precise. Arthur's smile was a practiced crescent. He wore a tie that had once been the color of victory. They placed the video quietly into the board minutes, an insert with enough legal formatting to make denial costly. Arthur's face on the screen turned from practiced charm to an occupant of his own conscience. When the clip played, the room cooled. People shifted. Arthur's hand betrayed a tremor he had not known he owned. He did not crumble immediately. He had lawyered his life into resilient forms. But public accusation, when layered with irrefutable time-stamp contradiction and candor in the exact wrong venue, is an eraser applied with force. The board voted to suspend Arthur, pending internal investigation. Landon Valerius complained through channels and then publicly couched his actions as prudence, the way predators couch appetite as stewardship. The news circuit smelled the blood of scandal. Markets opened and gossiped. Pundits constructed meaning from fragments. Renata and Nate watched from the war room as their small construct of justice began to take on the shape of consequence. Marcus's posture on the trading feeds tightened into choreography. Argent, like a stalking animal, waited for its moment. The kill switch would hinge on a Friday close rumor. The Trojan amendment would be the lever. In the quiet after the board's emergency motion, Nate went home. The city's lights threaded the elevator like a constellation. The fishbowl fell away, and he carried with him the weight of 68 waking hours and a pocket full of worry. Lily met him at the door with a shirt stained by art and a grin uneven by missing teeth. She ran into his arms, and the world arranged itself into a smaller problem, but one that mattered more than the headlines. She coughed once, a sound that made him still. He administered the pill with the ritual of sacred practice, the little bottle, the measured dosage, the soft exchange of affection. He studied her face, rosy cheeks, a scab on the knuckle from a fall, and catalogued small mercies, the way she called him Papa when she wanted a joke, the stuffed rabbit that smelled faintly of lavender. He told her a story, and she laughed in the place where laughter kept wrong things away. For a time, the world was the size of their cramped apartment, and nothing else mattered. At night, he lay awake and thought in pattern again. Concrete decisions need human courage, but they also need the arithmetic of timing.
Marcus would need to be at the trading desk at noon. Evelyn would file the counter-amendment at 3. Renata would present the evidence at the press stage at 4:30. They were a machine of people, and each person's timing mattered more than any algorithm. Nate mapped the hours like a man mapping the path of a storm. There was a moment before sleep when he touched Lily's hair and thought of his own father, who had taught him to fix radios with patience. The city hummed beyond their window like an animal, and far away a market bell chimed in the distance. It sounded to him like currency and danger. He slept badly, as men who have regained a muscle after long disuse do. Dreams full of ledger lines and mop handles, of signatures on glass. Friday approached with its peculiar hush. On the day, the war room moved with the efficiency of a small orchestra. Marcus, pale and focused, set his posture at the trading terminal. Evelyn polished the language of the counter-amendment until it read like law and like accusation simultaneously. Renata rehearsed her public face until she could perform disbelief in the exact measure she wanted. Nate did forensics like a man doing morning ritual. They waited for the market's tick to become a river. The city around the Onyx Tower seemed to measure time by breath. The elevator pulses, the subway's sigh. Renata, kept still. Her office windows held the glass motif they had used as a sigil, reflection and exposure. The pen rested on the desk like a detonator, gold and cold. The pen would be the symbol of finality. Somewhere in an executive room, Arthur would be confronted. Somewhere else, Landon was massaging the shape of advantage. Nate checked the video again, then the timestamps, then the courier's manifest. The tiny inconsistencies that men like Arthur leave in habit were present. A parking receipt with a time off by 3 minutes. A coffee receipt with a barista's name misspelled. An elevator maintenance ticket, signed but not processed. Little human things had a way of betraying given time. He felt, through the thin membrane of the world, the pressure of $300 million and hundreds of employees' careers, and his own daughter's next infusion, all balanced on the breath between minutes. A phone buzzed on the table, Renata's assistant, a soft tone that preferred efficiency. Marcus's screen blinked. Evelyn's fingers tapped the legal copy until it came alive with incremental certainty. Nate rose, steadying the mop of his hands on the edge of a low table, the old life still a reflex. They had a plan they had practiced in the space of thought. They had a proof chain, a public motion, and a market posture. They had recruited loyalty out of desperation. They had not counted on human arrogance, on Landon's appetite to weaponize speed as performance art. Argent would not hesitate if given the smallest opening. The brutality of algorithms is that they do not weigh consequence. They execute.
Their strategy depended on forcing the algorithm to eat itself. Marcus's mechanism would not be in code so much as in posture, a visible public body that would render activation meaningless and destructive to those who tried it. It was legal, theatrical, and utterly risky. Outside, the city took a breath that was all market and glass and people pretending to ignore the tension. Inside, Renata adjusted her cuff, and Nate tightened his jaw until it might have creaked. 48 hours compressed to a single bar of measure. He thought of Lily's sleeping face and felt a tide of resolve. Then the first signal arrived, a market whisper, barely audible across Marcus's feed. A rumor, a small footnote in an analyst's memo. It was enough. The room leaned in. The algorithm, patient and hungry, read the tremor and positioned. Marcus's fingers danced. Evelyn's email went out. Renata's speech was polished and waiting. They were minutes away from watching all their careful planning become the story that would determine whether the company would remain a place of hundreds of lives or be surrendered to predatory hands. Nate, who had learned to hide his competence under the cloth of mop duty, felt the familiar thrill. The work of ghosts returned to shape the city. He left the war room to walk the tower's lower halls. The vents breathed cold. In the service corridor, he paused and touched the paint where the tower's maintenance crew painted over graffiti, blank white where urgency met indifference. He thought of signatures, pens, and the brittle thinness of trust. He thought of his hands, which had once typed algorithms that made markets behave, and which now held a mop that smelled faintly of lemon. The path between those hands and this moment had been steeper than most people imagined. His phone buzzed once, a message from Marcus, "We're live in 10." He took the pill bottle from his pocket, closed his fingers around it, and made himself a promise he had no right to yet. Whatever happened in those minutes, he would carry the truth of it to Lily's smile afterwards. He walked the tower service stairs down to the street and felt the city's breath like a tide. The market feed flared. Small numbers became punctuation. A screen inside the war room displayed a feed of live trades, 1,000 tiny wars in pixels. Renata's voice, when it appeared at the podium, was an instrument. She presented the evidence like a woman reading scripture to skeptical parishioners, precise, cold, and impossible to ignore. Arthur's suspension was announced. Landon issued a statement couched in terms of fiduciary prudence. Marcus's posture at the trading desk became a performance of calm. Nate watched the live feeds, the image of the gold-plated pen running like a metronome in his mind. He felt the cold of marble and the warmth of Lily's cheek in a braided sensation. As the market approached its climax, the war room hushed into a sound like a held breath.
Outside, the city kept pretending that the day was ordinary. Then the feed staggered and screens rearranged into panic. Argent, sensing movement, initiated a sequence, and the market began to fold in on itself in a way that looked like art and felt like a trap. Marcus's counterposture activated, public trades placed, liquidity rerouted, a legal amendment filed live with broadcast commentary. 2 arenas, boardroom and market, moved in cruel, synchronized choreography. The kill switch had to work, not as code, but as consequence, and for a thudding moment it looked like their little arrangement might fail. Nate's phone rang. It was Lily. She had a question about her homework, and asked it in a voice softer than he had heard all morning. He knelt by the sink, where he had washed his hands 1,000 times, and answered her, giving short, tender replies. "Papa's busy, baby. I'll be home soon." She made a joke, and he laughed, and in the war room the sound threaded like an anchor through chaos. He could not tell her what swirled above them, the algorithm's teeth and the political hunger in the boardroom. He could only tell her he would come home. The feed shuddered again. Papers rustled. Evelyn's phone chimed, and she turned her face like someone taking a blow and smiling anyway. Renata's lips were a line. Marcus's hands moved faster.
The kill switch mattered. It was a moral instrument more than a technical contrivance. It would not erase wrongdoing, but would make the attempt to weaponize the amendment publicly self-destructive. The trading screen flashed. A sequence of trades executed on Marcus's instruction, not with the cold, ugly perfection of Argent, but with a war room's human hesitation and legal backing that turned the activation into a public catastrophe for its instigators. Numbers reversed as market actors, seeing the legal posture laid bare, withdrew. For a breath, it felt like the entire economy had paused and chosen sides. On the screen, Landon's smile faltered. In the boardroom recording, Arthur's face collapsed into the texture of real consequence. The media ate the story like a hive finding honey. Renata walked through the press scrum with the steadiness of someone who had practiced pain and turned it into leverage. Nate watched the moment of unmasking like a man seeing his own life clarified. His anonymity fell away in the public oxygen, but with it came the possibility of a different life. The company's share price stabilized and then reversed, public opinion pivoting like a weather vane. The Trojan Amendment was nullified by a motion the board could not refuse without looking complicit. Regulators filed notices, and the music of accountability began to play. They had won, but the victory felt precise and cold, like the edge of a blade. Arthur was escorted from the building. Landon issued a statement that read like a practiced apology packaged as prudence. Legal proceedings whispered the word indictment along the trading floors.
And Nate would learn how to work across headlines and hospital corridors and the small intimacies of fatherhood. They had pulled a public downfall off the ledger, but in doing so they had opened a new ledger to write on. There would be tribunals and indictments and slow legal machinery grinding into motion. The tower's glass would keep reflecting things, new threats, new alliances, and perhaps for Nate, a place at a table he had once only dreamed of glimpsing. As they closed that night, Renata sent Nate a single message: "Meet me tomorrow morning, we start rebuilding." Nate looked at Lily's sleep-smushed hair and closed his fist around the amber bottle for a second before setting it down. He imagined a future where the pill bottles stayed on the shelf and laughter took the place of dread. He imagined a small desk with a chair not for cleaning, but for thinking. The city hummed outside, and for the first time in a long time, the sound sounded like possibility. He fell asleep and dreamt of glass, not as a weakness, but as a surface that showed back what you chose to be. He woke to a sun that would not stop testing courage. And in the morning he would walk back into the fishbowl, into cameras and contracts and a team of improbable allies, ready to make his case not as a janitor, but as someone who had earned the place through risk and proof. There was more to come: public trials and private reckonings, adjustments that were not yet settled, and a quiet, persistent note that hinted at broader networks still unseen. But in that moment, with Lily breathing softly beside him, Nate allowed himself the small indulgence of relief. Outside the tower, the city continued to bargain in light and shadow. Inside, a father and his daughter were home. The pen had been seen for what it was. A janitor's hands had touched a data key, and in touching it, changed the course of a company. They had won a day. They had won a chance. Tomorrow would begin the work of turning exposure into protection. For now, Nate rested in the small warmth of a life he had thought irretrievable. Morning arrived with a thin, insistent light that slid under the curtains and matched the apartment in soft rectangles. Lily woke before Nate did, as if some small internal sun kept better hours than his worry. She padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, hair a dish of tangles, and made herself a bowl of cereal with solemn concentration. Nate watched her from the doorway, the mug warming his palms, and felt a steadying that had nothing to do with headlines.
They moved through the ordinary choreography of the day: backpack straps, mismatched socks, the negotiation over a lost mitten, until Lily was bundled and ready and impatient to be at school. Nate kissed the top of her head and felt the press of all he had to carry. At the corner where the sidewalk cut into their block, Renata arrived in a compact car that smelled of coffee and resolve.
She leaned out the window, all business and quick smile, and Lily flung herself into her arms. "Be good for Miss Klein," Renata told her, lowering Lily into the back seat like a practiced parent, and not a woman whose whole professional world had been shaken into new architecture in the last 48 hours. "And no cupcakes on the bus." Lily giggled. The small felicities held. The ride to the tower was a quiet one. Renata talked briefly: logistics, legal counsel she'd already lined up, the names of journalists to brief, but there was a steadiness that had the shape of someone who understood the work ahead. By the time Nate had passed through security and watched the revolving door close behind him, he felt the city switch its attention back to him, as if it were a mechanism to be wound. Evelyn's office smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and paper. She greeted him without preamble and sliding a slim file across her desk. The foam of the coffee in her cup had left a single ring on the blotter. "We're forming a transparency committee," she said, "public-facing, internal oversight. You will be the liaison for facilities and," she paused, choosing her words, "operations that touch privacy and access. You earned the right to sit at that table, Nate." He looked down at the file. It contained drafts, charters, a list of proposed members, language about independent audits and whistleblower protections. There were names he recognized, some allies, some people whose smiles on camera had never reached the places where decisions were actually made. He felt the weight of unease. Power, he had learned, often changed only the vocabulary of harm. "I don't want to be a figurehead," he said. The words surprised him by their firmness. "If I'm there, I want real authority, not just optics." Evelyn's expression softened into something like respect. "I don't need to be sold on your motives, but you should understand. This is as much about public trust as it is about legal cover. There will be people who want to maintain the old ways. You'll have to learn to read a new kind of silence. And you'll have to trust Renata to run the legal side." Renata met his eyes across the desk. "You won't be alone. We will set the rules together. There are people who will try to distract you with noise. Hold to what you know." They framed the first week: press briefings to clarify the company's stance, interviews with regulators, an internal mapping of systems and access logs that could no longer be allowed to sit in shadow. Marcus, with his wary charm, would stand at the podium to project stability, while Renata and the lawyers finished the work that would reduce exposure to spectacle. Nate was to be part symbol, part practical. When he left Evelyn's office, the corridors seemed longer. The tower hummed with phones and soft shoes. Strangers passed him, nodding when they recognized him from footage. Some with genuine gratitude, some with curiosity, others with the thin smile of people who measure advantage. For the first time he felt the dissonance between the man who knew how to buff a floor and the man who would now have to speak about policy in rooms of glass. He started by learning language. He sat in meetings, sometimes silent, letting Renata and the legal team lay out strategies, watching how the words cut or sheltered. He learned what an access control audit entailed and the difference between procedural change and cultural shift. He watched as Marcus rehearsed deflections and restraints, as reporters pushed for timing and spectacle, as the board convened behind closed doors to weave their narratives of culpability and competence. At night, after the official business had been done and the lights in the tower dimmed to the minimal glow of security, Nate sat at his small kitchen table with Lily's drawings spread before him.
The drawings were fierce in their simplicity. A stick family beneath a big sun, the tower rendered as a smiling rectangle. He kept them in a mug with utensils, and sometimes, when the outside world pressed hot against his jaw, he would take one and look at it until the edges of panic blunted. There were other nights when the residue of the scandal lodged in his chest like a stone he had to carry until it wore smooth. He learned to breathe around it. He learned to say the facts aloud. There would be investigations, there would be subpoenas, there would be people who were ruined and people who would not be touched. The law moved at its own uncompromising pace. Media moved in cycles of outrage that did not always correlate to truth. He learned to be patient, not because patience was easy, but because it was necessary. Then, on the 4th day after Arthur's fall, the city decided to remind him that visibility had edges. He had been finishing a late review of access logs when Renata's voice came through his phone, sharp, a notch higher than usual. "There's someone at the entrance," she said. "They left something. Security won't take it. They want you." Nate's stomach narrowed. He told Renata he'd be down in 2, locking the file in his head with the mechanical care of someone who knew how to compartmentalize. The package was plain, a white envelope with no return address, the glue at the flap dry. When he slid it open with the blunt edge of a key, a single card slid into his palm. It was heavy stock, embossed with an old-fashioned crest he didn't recognize at first, a stylized key crossed with an oak leaf, and below it, in neat printing, a single name, Landon Harrow. The name had been struck through with a thick black line. Underneath, in smaller type, was an address, a private club on the river, a place Nate had seen mentioned in business columns, the kind of place where deals and favors took place behind thick curtains. There was also a single line of text handwritten in an unhurried script. He never knew how sharp the glass could be until he reached for it. Renata watched him read it, and for the first time since the victory was declared, her face betrayed an old, practiced caution. "That crest," she said, "I've seen it on invitations, not public. Old money, private clubs, off-the-books committees. If Landon's name is stamped there—" "Then it's not just Landon," Nate said. The thought arrived like a cold wind. The fall had been large enough to expose a single man, but networks hid in the seams. They dressed themselves in philanthropy and after-hours toasts. They owned small, elegant things that mattered: access, information, plausible deniability. "What do we do?" he asked, less to Renata than to the card. "Not yet," she said. "We gather more. We don't act on a card. We don't give them the satisfaction of a chase. We build a case, and then we make it public so they cannot twist it into martyrdom." They kept the card sealed in an evidence envelope and had a security technician photograph it and log it. The act of logging turned the rumor into a document. It gave it weight and, perversely, the protection of process. Yet even in the rooms where process held sway, rumors bent toward people with power. A card was a taunt, a name was a map. Nate felt the old fear sharpen. How many names were written on that map? How many lives could be rerouted by their revelation? Minutes later, Marcus called. His voice was measured and bright on the line. "We will not be bullied into spectacle," he said. "We will continue with our schedules. The board supports transparency and the committee. Let the regulators do their work. Maintain the narrative that shows we are all cooperating." There was truth in the cadence. There was also theater. Nate felt the line between them like a seam he would have to learn to sew without being seen. Over the next days, the calendar thickened. Depositions, interviews, a closed-door inquiry with a panel of regulators who smelled faintly of lemon and old power. Renata coached him on testimony. "Stick to what you know," she repeated. "Do not speculate. Name processes. point to logs. You do not need to embroider justice with rhetoric. The facts will do that work. He practiced in a glass conference room. The city spread below like an array of small, indifferent miracles. He learned how to transfer the dignity of his old life into the language of policy, how to explain access controls to people with degrees and little direct touch of the work itself, how to turn a mop's route into a rule about accountability. He found that his metaphors came back to the physical: a locked door, an authority badge, a cleaning schedule that could be an audit trail.
People listened. Their eyes sharpened in the way of people who hear something they had not expected to find useful. Outside, Landon's supporters muttered that the move against him had been a vendetta. Pundits declared the story a cautionary tale about the cruelty of corporate cleansings. The network didn't dissolve into silence. It adjusted like an organism jostled and then rearranged. That evening, a column printed an obituary of a career that had been, as the columnist wrote, complicated. The cruelty of language was not lost on Nate. He could see both the moral calculus and the human breakdown. In the middle of it, Lily needed a bandage for a scraped knee and a story read before bed. There were interviews he could decline and testimonies he could reframe, but there was no trimming the small, necessary tasks of fatherhood. Those moments, tucking a sock back over a foot, arguing for an extra bedtime story, were subtle proof that life could keep its bearings even when the world tried to tilt it. At night, Nate returned to the card. He put it under a lamp and turned it over, hunting for micro-embossing, for any trace of who had printed it. He called a friend in a different department, someone who could pull records without making a show. The friend came back with a note. The crest had been associated with a series of private donations and dark money transfers to a web of foundations that pretended to promote civic good. Follow the receipts, the friend wrote, and you do not stop at a name. You find accounts and the people whose hands rested on the levers. The revelation was less dramatic than a film, but more ominous. It meant the fight would not confine itself to the glass tower or the boardroom. It reached into institutions that could smother inquiry in a tangle of philanthropy and plausible purpose. It meant that for every motion they made in the light, there were hands in rooms that wanted to make sure that light never found the ledgers. Nate understood then what Renata had meant about reading silence. The card was not a threat so much as an invocation. "We know where you stand," it said, "and we will test how long you can stand there." He placed the card back into the evidence envelope and took a long breath. For a heartbeat, he let himself imagine retreat, the soft ease of a life where his greatest worries were stains to be scrubbed and a landlord's caprice. But the thought slid off as if through glass. There was no returning to the exactness of what had been. The world had been altered by action and by consequence. There were people who would benefit from his silence and others who would be harmed if he allowed the networks to persist. He locked the file drawer and walked to Lily's school to pick her up, carrying with him the hum of decisions and the small, steady joy of a child's wave at his approach. On the walk home, she chattered about a painting she'd made of a castle, of a prince who had lost a key and learned to ask for help.
It was, he realized, a parable of the ordinary. That night, after Lily slept, Renata called again. She had new information from a regulator, a scheduled meeting, a list of questions they could expect, and the names of 2 foundation trustees that matched the crest on the card. One of those trustees had a direct line to a senator's aide. The other was a figure who turned philanthropic addresses into policy windows. "If you want to make a dent," Renata said, "we go slow and we go deep. We do not let them dictate the narrative by attacking us in public. We gather evidence, we protect witnesses, and we make the regulators' work impossible to ignore."
Nate folded his hands around the edge of the card, feeling its weight like a promise and a challenge. Outside, the city's light flickered. Advertising screens, late commuters, a restless river. Inside, the apartment held the small, stubborn artifacts of life. Lily's drawings, a mug with a chip on its rim, a coat left draped over a chair. He thought of the boardroom table he was about to sit at, of the people who would expect him to translate truth into policy. He had, he realized, crossed a threshold. The victory they'd won felt less like an ending and more like a flaring of the first campfire in a long night. Allies gathered around the light. Shadows stirred at the edges, curious and patient. He slid the card into his pocket and let the night settle, not as a promise of safety, but as the interval between decisions. In the morning they would meet. They would make a plan. And he, who had once been measured by the neatness of a floor, would have to measure his courage against a network that preferred the dark. Somewhere in the city, in a private room with curtains drawn, a hand reached for a different card and smoothed it between its fingers, imagining how the next move would look in headlines. The game had shifted. The rules were not yet clear. Nate slept, and in his rest, the glass of the world kept reflecting what he chose to be. He woke with the taste of coffee and the sense that tomorrow's conversations would be the ones that decided not only his fate, but the shape of many others. He stood and went to the window, watching a bus crawl by and a woman with a stroller navigating a wet curb. The tower across from his apartment caught the low sun and threw it back in a color that was not quite triumph and not quite warning. He put his hand against the pane and for a moment felt the cool give of it, the reliable barrier between him and whatever pull the city might exert. Then he turned, because Lily would be awake soon and because there was work to do. He had a table to walk toward, a chair not for cleaning, but for choosing. He would sit in that chair and learn the language of systems, of audits, of the small legalisms that keep secrets alive. He would ask questions and demand records. He would teach himself how to make the light that day by day, might be enough to make the glass less sharp. There were more lines to draw, more voices to be heard, and a network that would not collapse simply because one of its pieces had fallen. But Nate had a card, a list of names, and a team that would not let procedural delays become a refuge for wrongdoing. He folded the evidence envelope into the pocket of his coat and stepped out into the day, the city opening before him like a problem he had finally been given permission to solve. He did not know which door would lead to the truth, only that he would try them all. He walked, and the glass in the skyline answered with 100 small reflections, each one a mirror he could choose to look into or away from.